Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to Opcode Virtual Summit.
Let's get ready. Yeah, and we are live now.
Hello. This is the panel on responsible disclosure or irresponsible disclosure. And we've got Costin and Casey. Costin is from Kaspersky, great, which he is. And Casey is, of course, from Bugcrowd and Australia. You'll want to introduce yourself, Costin?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me at Opcode. The second time for me. I was also supposed to be participating in the real Opcode a couple of times, I guess, in Abu Dhabi. And I found ways to excuse myself, sadly. But now I'm back. I'm the director of the Global Research and Analysis team at Kaspersky. And to be honest, although the title sounds more like boring management, I like to do a lot of research. I'm kind of heads down kind of a guy. I like to do a lot of research, writing Yara rules, looking at things such as 637 that one amazingly talked about. And I used to do some exploit development like a long time ago, including vulnerability disclosure back in the days, and a bit of it also more recently. And I'm, of course, very happy to be here with you guys to speak about this.
Cool. And Casey?
Yeah, morning, everyone. Yeah, sure thing. So, yeah, just as the background suggests, I am in Australia right now. I'm normally in San Francisco, but we had decided to bug out down here ahead of the whole COVID thing. So we're here until we can go back. But yeah, I'm the founder, chairman, and CTO of Bugcrowd. I've been in security, pretty much since high school and kind of transitioning into that, more from a pen test kind of hacking standpoint at that point in time. Moved across into the called the dark side of solutions and kind of the more front end of the business set of things in about 2010. And then, that got it in my head that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I think the thing with Bugcrowd was really the idea of like, how do we connect, like this is a people problem, getting security research, getting security feedback. We're talking about technology, but it's fundamentally a people problem. Like vulnerabilities are the product of things that get decided in certain ways that end up being weak. And bad guys are motivated by human incentive. So how do we get more people into the mix to help with getting ahead of that stuff and making things more secure? And I think as a part of that, Bugcrowd spawned out basically a standardization project called the vulnerability open source vulnerability disclosure policy framework, which is now Disclosure.io. And the whole idea behind that is like, how can we just make this normal? How can we make it so that security research isn't needing to be done with one eye over the shoulder to see if someone's going to have a problem with it, legally or from a commercial standpoint, and how do we get all of that stuff out there? So yeah, I've been waiting around in this space for quite a long time, and good to be here.
Cool. Right. So I'll be honest, I'm a little bit surprised why we have to have this panel, because I thought that disclosure was solved in the 90s.
It's all fixed. Yeah, total.
Yeah. So, I mean, why is it still going on? Why has this not been solved? See, Casey, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, look, I mean, the thing that we've seen happen, like, the thing that Bugcrowd needed to deal with back in 2012 was this sort of pervasive idea that a hacker was automatically a bad person. And that was very much kind of the dominant view that people had at that point in time. And that's, I think since shifted. I don't think it's not a problem now, but it's definitely not the same as it was back at that point in time. So that's good. That was when a lot of the, responsible versus coordinated versus all that other stuff was going on. And we kind of got, mostly over that hump, which is a good thing. But now I think frankly, it's an awkward conversation. There's still a hell of a hangover from the idea of scary hackers, like even down to, some of the risk around election disinformation right now. I'd put more of that down to the fact that like a non-technical user is worried about getting hacked, even though they don't know what it means. There's still this kind of fear of the unknown. And I think very practically speaking, it's an awkward conversation. Like if you're not prepared to get feedback that your stuff's broken, the first time that happens, it does tend to be quite a confronting thing for an organization or an individual to go through. So there's all these like versions of that are happening for the first time. And I think the reason that it's still a conversation is that not everyone's done it yet. I don't think everyone's like moved onto the front foot to say, okay, we need to be able to hear from the internet. And I don't think everyone's actually experienced that yet. So in the absence of there being a common experience and a common kind of like, yeah, let's do this, or let's do it this way, you end up with things getting broken sometimes.
Right. Okay. So I guess what would Disclosure.io be bringing to the table for that? Because it seems like if you're saying that there's not a broadly accepted framework that's adopted.
Yeah. For sure. Go ahead.
It's just like, this is not the first framework that's come out. So, why are you different than any of the 20 other ones that we've had before?
Yeah, totally. It's like we've got a problem with 99 frameworks, so let's create another one, and now we've got a problem with 100 frameworks. The idea with Disclosure is two things. One is to collapse and simplify everything. Like one of the big things with briefs, like vulnerable disclosure briefs and bug bounty briefs and all that stuff, is that half the time people don't read that shit anyway, especially some of the newer hunters that are coming into the space. Like they just want to see that there's some sort of permission there, and then once they've seen that, they'll just go. Obviously, you want to try to educate and have people, actually go through and be careful. But in practice, that's not going to happen 100% of the time. So how can you simplify? I think the thing that's different about the language that we put up is it's actually quite short. Like what we tried to do was to balance this idea of legal completeness with readability for people that are like English as a second language, or like that aren't native to the language that brief's been written in. But not at the full expense of it being as legally complete as it can be. So that's one side of it. I think the other side that we've really doubled down on since we kind of relaunched the thing as Disclosure and started to make it its own kind of collective is this idea of like safe harbor and the idea of, the existing legal frameworks around hacking still having been constructed before the concept of good faith. The CFAA was literally a product of Ronald Reagan going and watching war games and freaking out and asking the DOJ to come up with a solution for it. It hasn't really changed much since then. So the idea of there being a locksmith as well as a burglar, I think, is better recognized by like our community. It's better recognized by the industry, but the law doesn't reflect that. So that's probably another difference, is that we've really focused on making sure that in the absence of that being better constructed, and in lieu of it changing at some point in the future, how do we create carve-outs to make sure that this stuff is safe?
All right, that's pretty good. I want to shoot back to the 90s for a minute because, apparently...
It's a good decade.
Yeah, we had the best clothes.
Absolutely.
Things that have aged very, very poorly. 90s cool. Basically back in the day, we did have all of these disclosure debates, and we did come out with, our set of base assumptions. And, those of us who have been around for a while, when new people are joining the debate, we get very frustrated that, we did this in 95. Where were you guys? Oh, you weren't born yet. Well, anyway, so what I'm wondering is, are we wrong in that, everything we need to know we got in the 90s, or has anything like what's changed since then? Do we need to update our assumptions that we established? And I'm going to throw that to Costin because he looks bored.
Yeah, Costin. No, I'd love to hear.
Well, as Casey was talking, I was thinking about that more specifically, how things were in the 90s. And I guess that one way to describe this vulnerability disclosure is pretty much it feels like it's a bit like rediscovering the wheel, and I think that a lot of companies are going through this process of rediscovering the wheel, and the process probably has a couple of steps. The first step is always denial. There's like, if you remember those PC Mac adverts from more than 10, 15 years ago. It's like first thing they say is, we don't have any vulnerabilities. Our products are super secure. We have no bugs. That's the denial phase. But there's nothing of sorts. The next level after denial is when somebody actually starts up to come up with problems. They are like, trying the legal way, trying to sue the guys, trying to shut them down, to buy them off, and all sorts. And to be honest, this is still happening, by the way. And the next step from there, I guess, is acknowledgements, but still no, let's say, incentives for people, no incentives, and not just that, but no special steps to make it safer and easier for independent researchers to do that. And probably the next step from there is the bug bounty programs, where there's actual financial incentives. And I do remember 97. In 97, or people don't remember those times, it was the launch of Windows NT version 4 by Microsoft. I think it happened 1 year before. So there were a lot of discussions around the security of Windows NT 4. It was a guy by the name of Konstantin Sobolev who came up with an exploit called getadmin. And I think that exploit was probably used by a lot of hackers out there for many, many years because it was just so solid and reliable to just get administrative access. And Microsoft patched it. I think they released this patch with SP3, but also they had a kind of a hotfix. So back in the days, I was spending a lot of time with Softice, if you guys remember that debugging software. Debugging kernel crashes. So it took me a couple of hours just to find another vulnerable function in Windows 32 cases. I wrote an exploit for there that would just do the same thing as getadmin. So I confirmed that actually it can be exploited very easily. And I sent an email to Microsoft about it. And there was pretty much nothing happening. No reply, no acknowledgement. I sent another one, and I think it was another one. And there was absolutely like nothing, complete silence. Then after a while, there was like the patch for the bug that I reported, without like anything, no acknowledgement, no nothing. And it was kind of frustrating. So I decided to drop the exploit on NTSec, and from there was forwarded to Bugtrack by LF. And well, obviously it became public. There was definitely irresponsible disclosure. So if we judge it by the norms that we have nowadays, I guess it's kind of irresponsible because, well, there was no communication, no coordination involved. But the frustration was also big. It was funny that after a while I got an email from Microsoft, and they said, "Hey man, thanks for reporting this. And by the way, can we send you something like a hat or a T-shirt for reporting it?" And I said, "Sure." Well, would be nice to get a hat or T-shirt, but would be even nicer if I can get something like Visual C++ 2.0 or something like this. There was still like $100 back in the days. Was a big fortune. It was quite nice. They actually sent me that. But I guess, and that this brings me to my point. We used to have a consultant in the company, an American consultant in our company. I used to work for a different company. He came to me in regards to this story, and he asked me something which I thought was so stupid. And he said, "So you reported this bug to Microsoft?" I said, "Yes." And he asked me, "Did you ask them for money?" And I was like, what? To ask them for money to report a bug doesn't make sense. It seemed like a completely stupid idea, but I guess nowadays this is also kind of an important thing in the whole equation of vulnerability disclosure, incentivizing people to look into these things, part of the whole ecosystem. I think bug bounties are also important. But yeah, going back to the 90s, it felt like that.
Yeah, it's interesting you call it out at the end there, because I think, like, I clearly, given what we do, I agree on the incentive side of it. I think one of the downsides to it has been that there's a very blurry definition between like a vulnerability disclosure program, a bug bounty program, which in my mind is a vulnerability disclosure program where rewards have been added to all or part of the scope. And then this concept of like crowdsourced security, where things are being done privately and all of that. Like, when we got going, is the back end of 2012, and it was just the concept of bug bounties was just starting to bubble up in the valley, and then it caught this huge tailwind at the back of 2013 as a bunch of players jumped in. Like, it was partly our doing, partly other platforms kind of coming online and starting up, and then partly some of the larger programs that kind of joined in at that point. And Microsoft was one of them, because that was quite oh wow, okay, I didn't think you guys would do it type of moment, at which point it got kind of topical, which is great, as I said, for getting folk over the hump of like, hackers aren't necessarily all bad. Like, some of us are actually, able to do stuff that's helpful as well, like get past that thing. But the downside of it that I think we're dealing with now is that this is conflation of all of these different concepts under this one banner. It's like, oh, that's a bug bounty program. No, it's disclosure. It's responsible, coordinated-ish. It's got NDAs on it, so that's wrong. And the whole thing just gets all kind of muddy because it hasn't been laid out. So that's something that, frankly, it's a challenge for all of us in the space. I think it's a challenge for a lot of the people that are actually operating these programs as well. And there's a lot of stuff being done to try to disambiguate that. I think going back to Grugq's question on the digital natives and the digital boomers of vulnerability disclosure in that sense, I completely agree. Like, there's the thing that we see where I actually think there's a lot that can be learned in both directions. Like the newer folk, like, I always believe that's true just as a general kind of life principle, but like the newer folk learning from the younger folk, since this has become so much more accessible and there is this financial incentive tied to bounties, what we've seen is this like influx of net new folk, a chunk of which are talented, a chunk of which want to be and aren't yet, but they're all keen to get involved and do something. And they don't realize how hard it's been for folk in our generation from this standpoint. It's like what that nets out to is the amount of user empathy that you've got as a vulnerability reporter. Like, you're sitting there saying, okay, I understand a little bit better because I've skinned my knees. I've potentially had to deal with like angry lawyers or PR people or even the law itself. Like, I actually understand like the criticality of the conversation that we're trying to have here, and I've got some empathy in how I operate because of that. Like, the newcomers don't tend to have that because they just think that it's how it should work. It can kind of equate to an entitlement, which I think around this particular subject actually becomes dangerous pretty quickly. So that's right. One of the areas
what's the difference between a vulnerability disclosure out of nowhere with a request for a bug bounty and extortion?
Exactly.
That was something that we were very aware of back in the day, but now, people, they seem to think that it's just normal to get paid.
Yeah, well, and it can still be extortion. Like, there's cases where that's actually been used as a mask for extortion. So, I think we're far from normalizing it. Definitely where the trends are kind of shaking out is starting to become fairly clear. But in terms of it being like a consensus-driven or a standardized thing, I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah. So, somewhat related to that, it's even though bug bounties are now much bigger, and there is this very large population of people who have been, I guess, brought up with the idea of disclosure by default. we're still finding 0 days in the wild. Today there was the iOS mail exploit that got didn't get dropped, but we found out about it. There's been the Zoom 0 days that are apparently being sold for $500,000, and I can tell you one thing: they're not being bought for $500,000. I'm wondering, maybe how do you think bug bounties are failing in addressing these sort of more high-end big targets? Is it that Apple doesn't have a bug bounty, or Zoom hasn't had one?
That's I think it's a pretty interesting question and point of view here, and I think that you've previously talked about this as well from some people who are saying, like, we can do, I have a 0 day, I can do two things with it. I can either report it to the vendor, to Apple, whatever, it gets a small amount of money and get it fixed. Or I can sell it through reputable sources, reputable channels where I know it's used by the good guys, and make maybe 10 times more. And what are the ethics here, and which one is the better course? I guess there's also, by the way, there's also people out there for sure who do both. So how do you build up like a reputation? And maybe you also have a lot of experience with building up the reputation. But let's say that well, not me, but maybe someone who is completely unknown wants to sell some 0 days through some of these high stakes buyers. He basically, nobody knows him. And one way is just to start by getting into a couple of advisories, maybe from Microsoft, from these big companies. You see his name, and then people recognize his name, and that obviously makes it much easier for him to move to the other game. But for sure, there is this huge gap between the bug bounties that vendors are paying and the money that you can get from selling it to
this one exactly. This one comes up a lot, and I think there's a couple of things. Like there isn't necessarily a viable or an active offensive acquisition market for a lot of the organizations that have launched bug bounty programs over the past 5 or 6 years, for example. Like Apple, Google, like Microsoft, Adobe. Okay, they make sense to go off and buy exploits for if you're trying to do offensive work. Like if you're talking about platform providers, for example, that's probably not as sensible, because ultimately oftentimes the bug is being fixed in one place, at which point it's gone. So if you start exploiting it, or if you're trying to use it in a campaign that's identified, there's a fix, the time to live on the product you've created from that vulnerability is short, which to me means the value of it is comparatively lower, right? Zoom is obviously an interesting one in this, because I think a lot of the attention on them is kind of a function of the fact that they 10x'd overnight, which is not something that happens every day. But they're somewhat of an outlier, I think, in the equation here. But really, what it comes down to is that, like, Apple do have a defensive acquisition program, and there's pricing that gets plastered all over the internet on the cost of an iOS chain on any given day. And it usually, what I've noticed is it tends to run at about a third. What we've seen when there isn't an offensive competitor for a bug is that it tends to run more like a fifth or so. And the main reason is that the point of value for defensive acquisition is when the information goes from point A to point B. Like once the person who owns the product knows about the bug, that's pretty much it. They can go in and get some more detail or whatever, collaborate with the researcher, but it's gone from unknown to known at that point, and that's the point of value. Whereas in the offensive space, like you've got to take it, weaponize it, you've got to build your business model around it in whatever form that takes. The value chain that's created persists beyond that transit of the knowledge of the bomb from A to B. So there are some pretty interesting kind of quirks to the deltas in the actual economics of it. And that whole area is really interesting, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few things that came up there that we should address. One, I think, is how Apple has moved to make it harder to actually do security research on their platform. They've got the lawsuit against Corellium, and their alternative to that was supposed to be these special security research devices, but those aren't being shipped. I've been asking for months, and I don't know anyone that has received one. So Apple seems to be no, they're not actually a good faith participant, maybe. Another thing is the difference between defensive and offensive markets, which Casey covered fairly well, but I guess there's a bit more to talk about there. And then the third thing is, again, something Casey just lightly mentioned on, is how historically we've had the situation where people have had applications. So there'll be thousands of people who are vulnerable and thousands of people who need to patch. Now we have web apps where thousands of people are vulnerable, but only one company needs to patch. So anyone who wants to address any of those three issues?
Costin, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this one, because this is
well, again, there's so many things and so many points of view with pretty much all these different things. Another thing that I was thinking about, by the way, as we were talking about, and I see there's a question in the chat also, or somehow related. Yeah, Dave Vaitel is asking a lot of tricky questions. But I've seen somebody else also ask about if somebody has ever been prosecuted for discovering or selling 0 days and under what law. And I do remember two kind of cases that we can give as an example. I remember there was a case of a Turkish exploit developer that was selling them, and he got in trouble and probably is still in jail at the moment. I apologize, I can't remember his name at the moment. The other kind of interesting case is the one of Vitaly Toropov, who became, let's say, kind of famous after the hacking team hack, when his name became public as an exploit seller. He was selling to hacking team, and a lot of his vulnerabilities, let's say, they had a certain feeling. You could kind of guess which one were his exploits from the code. And we noticed something interesting is that after that story, Vitaly Toropov, well, he was based in Russia. He had like one of these, let's say, income tax profiles. So basically, someone could do research on how much money he was making and so on, because he tried to do it, I guess, in a kind of a legal way. What was interesting, however, is that after that story became public, I think Sophacy APT, they burned about 50 days in a row, and all those 50 days they kind of had his mark in theirs. And I was wondering if actually after the story became public, if actually he was somehow coerced into giving them up, and the rate at which these 0 days were being burned was absolutely insane, one after another. And it seemed like when one was burned, there was another one ready to be burned, but with like almost in the same place. Vulnerability was like a few lines above or below the previous one, so it all felt like someone was pushing him. Yeah, there's like a lot of different things which can happen here. Of course, Casey, I think, has a lot of experience as well with such things.
Well, and I think this is sort of goes back to what we're talking about with how things have evolved since the 90s as well, because the laws the overarching kind of approach that's taken legally that's in play more often with ODA is actually the DMCA, not so much the CFAA. Like the DMCA, it's the Copyright Act essentially, but it's been used quite a lot to do things around security research that involve bypassing anti-circumvention controls within software, which tends to be stuff that you can pick up and hold. Like it's your software, whereas CFAA is generally more relevant to someone else's software. So the fact that I think like SaaS and our reliance on platforms, I mean, even right now, that's been a shift, I think, in how we consume technology overall, which reflects on the available target space for security research across the board, but also I think what bad actors and even what offensive buyers that you could think of as good actors are most interested in from a targeting standpoint. So there's been a whole bunch of different shifts from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned something interesting, is that not all exploit use is necessarily bad. There are, I guess we'd say, legitimate uses. So going slightly on that in terms of the law, I'm gonna grill you, Casey, because I've got a bone to pick with you, sir.
Join the queue, buddy.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
So, as curious in what role do you believe that NDAs play in securing the internet? Are they necessary? Do they do more harm than good? And how exactly does a non-disclosure agreement relate to disclosure?
Okay, I'll answer the second one first. A non-disclosure agreement does not relate to disclosure, I think. And that's in the ideal world once, everyone's on the same page about how this works and what's okay, what's not okay. Kind of going back to where we started with why is this still even a conversation in the first place, is that the internet hasn't really agreed how to do it well. So you end up in a position where, okay, you're doing security research. I, as the vendor, have the right, or at least feel like I have the right, to go after you legally to control what you do with that information that you've found. You end up in this really awful position where submitting a vulnerability in good faith to try to make things more safe actually almost creates a condition where you've incriminated yourself at that point. So I think the confusion around NDAs being a part of disclosure is actually that's not a good thing at all. So back to the first question, this is kind of what I was getting at a bit earlier on around the difference between disclosure and crowdsourcing. Like if you're going out to a group of people and saying, okay, we want to invite you in, it's basically the situation where the program owner is the one who initiates the conversation, as opposed to the security researcher or the hacker being the one who initiates the conversation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the latter, in my mind, is disclosure, and like, you found the bug. As long as you're taking on your own risk and your own kind of legal things that might be around what you're doing, you're effectively, there's nothing effectively stopping you from doing anything other than the potential for recourse, right? If it's an invitation to participate in something, that's different. That's kind of like getting invited in to do contract work, or getting invited in to be employed, being invited in to do something under Chatham House, whatever else. That's where I still think that whole idea of non-disclosure, I think, is quite reasonable, just as a function of doing business. But where these two things, or the two concepts, get confused, I think that's super dangerous. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I can see. Yeah. If it's initiated by the company, requiring an NDA to participate is very different from someone approaching and saying, here's the thing I found. And as we've seen loads of times, companies go, great, here's an NDA, and never talk about this again. So
yeah, no, absolutely. And look, I think transparency and everything getting fixed, that's the ideal state. Like my utopian view of software security is almost where we're applying Kirchhoff's principle to how we build things. I would love that to be how it works. Like the reality is that we're a long way from that, but I think that's the aspirational kind of goal and logically where the internet's going to wind up at some point in the future. So ergo, transparency is a fundamental part of how we secure ourselves. But at the same time, discretion and the flow of information, the control of that is a part of business and business practice. So how do you kind of reconcile those two things? I will say that, the way that this debate or this kind of, it's like this huge conspiracy or whatever else is being reduced is actually not very productive either. Because what it's doing is it's giving all of the work that's being done to make disclosure without this sort of thing in place more normalized a bad rap, and it's actually making it harder for the right things to become more common.
I'm going to reference a question from the third member of our panel who chickened out and decided not to actually join us, Dave Itel. But Costin, in terms of transparency and non-disclosure, are there implants that you would not disclose?
So, well, first of all, I wonder if Dave chickened out because we were using Zoom, so he's afraid of us using those $500,000 nowadays on his Zoom account. Well, more seriously, I mean, on his question, which is a very good question, and the eternal debate about what's ethical, and well, I've said it many times, I'm all for transparency. We can't make exceptions. Like, this is the basic rule of detecting malware, is that you cannot make exceptions for anyone. And well, imagine if you just start making exceptions for someone, then that immediately will be, let's say, picked up in all sorts of ways. It can be picked up by the media. And even worse, imagine that you're simply choose not to detect some malware or exploit, right? And then somebody else finds that, they just take the malware and they use it against the country, let's say, of the first attacker. So with the security products, it just doesn't work like that. You have to detect everything. I guess there's a fine point there between detection and disclosing. And I think this is a more subtle kind of a question, if the disclosure actually helps or not. And there's, for instance, a number of ODAs which have been recently patched in Windows. There's been a lot of, let's say, shady things around these 0 days, such as it's unclear who reported them. They've, let's say, Microsoft kind of warned about them, but again, there hasn't been a patch for some time, so it took them quite a while to make a patch. And there have been a bunch of rumors about the fact that these ODAs were used, let's say, by certain actors. But nevertheless, Project Zero, Google Project Zero, did research, did report them. In the end, I think it was Google Project Zero who discovered those 0 days. And it's quite possible that they were used for very legitimate reasons. But again, exceptions, once you start going into that direction, there's no turning back. So you can't make exceptions.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point. And I think in a way, if you are a legitimate threat actor and you cannot bypass a commercial AV, then up your game. It's not their job to make exceptions for you. It's your job to do better than them. So I think that's it's all in the game. It's entirely fair. So let's see. One thing that happened very recently today was the IBM confusing a vulnerability disclosure for a bug bounty report and saying, no, it's out of scope, and then having ODAs dropped on them. So I think that maybe goes back to the confusion that you were talking about, Casey, that the people getting.
No, definitely. I mean, not to speak to that particular situation because I'm not inside it, but looking at it from the outside in and having seen things like that before. There are aspects of doing a bug bounty program that's don't necessarily involve or include this idea of hey guys, we should be able to see, hear things that come in from the internet. Like I think, the vuln disclosure and bug bounty programs are run best by the companies that recognize that like vulnerabilities are functionally a product of the fact that humans make mistakes sometimes, and instead of treating that like a thing that gets almost suppressed in how they talk about it. It's like, that's a part of what we're going to have to work with as a software developer. Mm-hmm. So let's figure out how to identify when that's happened, how to learn from it, and how to try not to repeat it again in the future. This is another area where, not everyone's there. That's kind of the utopian state. And there's some companies that do that really well. But it's not the default, I don't think. And you end up in this position where the engagement with security researchers can get confused internally with this overall idea of a vuln disclosure process or program. Mm-hmm. And that's when stuff like this happens. The other example is when people, or when organizations go out and do a whole bunch of signaling around their bug bounty program, but they haven't necessarily built out vulnerability coordination on the back mm-hmm. end. So they've got, and this is something that, one of the areas where Katie and I are in pretty violent agreement when it comes to incentivizing from the open internet. Like being able to do something with what you hear is pretty important too. So have you done that piece? There's all sorts of different ways that can get conflated, but what we do see is organizations that do it well. Like you can get to that point where it is just a part of how you build software. Clearly with this particular case, that wasn't fully kind of socialized across the business and not everyone was on the same page.
Yeah, cool. You brought up basically the DDoS spy vulnerability report problem that can be exposed, where basically if you only have so many engineers watching your bug queue, and you suddenly get 10 times as many bug reports, then
and I think with that, straight up, I think almost any organization that needs security feedback can potentially benefit from crowdsourcing because it lets them access people that they find it otherwise hard to access. That's on the private basis. I think every organization should have a vulnerability disclosure policy and an intake channel, because I think that's becoming just a part of corporate social responsibility on the internet, right? When you talk about a bug bounty program in the public sense, where it's, hey, everyone, have at us and we'll pay you if you find something, I think that there's a far narrower group of organizations that's actually suitable for right now and probably into the future as well, because you do have to have that ability to respond quickly and be quite mature in that respect. So there is a difference there too.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting kind of close to the end, but there was a good question in the chat that I want to bring up, which is the thoughts on bug severity and disclosure timelines. Mentioning, for example, the Intel bugs that were embargoed for about a year versus the Project Zero hard 90-day limit. So does anyone, Costin, opinions?
Absolutely. I think the severity has a very, let's say, significant, should have a very significant impact on the disclosure timeline. I'll give you an example. Possibly, let's say that the amount of people that are affected, not just that people that could be potentially affected, but the actual number of people who are affected, let's say right now about this. And that means that whatever vulnerability is being exploited in the wild, and maybe there are thousands of people out there who are being targeted and infected for this vulnerability, that kind of justifies, in my opinion, a shorter disclosure timeline. So a deadline of something like 2 weeks or 30 days in such cases when the impact is huge, a bug that can potentially affect millions of people, and we know it's already in the wild, it's already getting exploited. And you know that the moment there's a rumor about a patch, then the attackers will try to basically get the best possible bang for the buck from this bug, and they're gonna be targeting everybody. And there, it absolutely makes sense to have shorter disclosure windows. At the same time, the bugs that are not necessarily remote code execution bugs, but maybe that require pre-existing access to that system, such as maybe reading processor memory from different states and so on. Maybe those are not that severe, and so in that cases, in my opinion, it makes sense to have longer disclosure timelines.
That and the system complexity as well. Like, the 10-cent stuff that came out in Tesla were able to, ingest that, fix it, regression test it, and roll it out to their fleet, I think in 12 days end to end, which is not normal for a fleet of vehicles that's on the road. So there's all sorts of different things in terms of how long it's actually going to take to mitigate or remediate in the wild that come into play there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. We have no time, but I'm still going to sneak in a last question because I think it's quite relevant. This is for Casey, and I'm curious. We have all these different disclosure debates, but do we have any data about anything? So, like, do we have a way of measuring effectiveness? Like, this full disclosure got a bug fixed in 3 days versus this private disclosure, it was vulnerable for 6 months. Do we have any way of doing that? And how would we know if things are working? So.
Yeah. So in like the comparison across different types of program, no. And I don't think we're working at a point where the law of large numbers is fully in effect yet. Like, full disclosure is a pretty effective way to get people to pay attention, but it's also incredibly disruptive and causes all sorts of other things. So like there's like anecdotal stuff you can pull together and just kind of look at it like that. With the broader data set and the way that I want to look at that kind of data, I would say the answer to that is, you can see the trends, but the overall data set doesn't really exist in a consolidated way yet. What I look for, what I think is starting to be kind of circled around in the market, two things for a vuln disclosure program. It's really the responsiveness. Like, how long does it take an organization to actually fix an issue? Are they getting back to the reporter quickly? Are they maintaining that contact? Are they like not leaving people in the dark? And do they get the issue remediated, especially if it's critical, in a space of time that's ideally getting shorter as a trend, as they get better at that? Because this is all about feedback loops. It's not about like whacking a bug, it's about improvement. And then on the bounty side, I think it's, do you have, like, I sort of think of it like like a fireproof safe. When you go out and buy a fireproof safe, it says this thing will last for 6 hours at 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. When you think about what defenders are doing, it's like their job is to increase the cost of attack. So, okay, is the bug price going up over time with like the same or a lower cadence of valid vulnerabilities being discovered in that software? I think that's a rough proxy, but yeah, that's forming.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say that in terms of using price as a proxy, the source of the pricing matters because, for example, in a bug bounty program, there's only one buyer for the bug. So the demand for, I guess, Facebook bugs is only really Facebook. No one else is going to get much value out of that overall, sort of generally speaking. But when you're talking about the offensive market, there's, also the demand side, which has an impact on pricing, and that could be more important. So, even even for Microsoft, if demand goes up, but the number of bugs that are available or that are available as fully formed exploits is fixed, the price is going to go up without that being an indication.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. The price is ultimately set by the market. I do think it's like vulnerabilities as like overall right across the board are like this really weird type of gold that like sometimes like self detonates and sometimes it pops up somewhere different, and like there's all these weird kind of attributes to it. But the idea of it being scarce and progressively more difficult to find as more people go looking for it, because part of what you're also doing as a finder is trying to beat the other guy. A lot of those attributes of the marketplace, I think, are actually quite similar. So I think, as this goes along, like that pricing stuff starts to normalize and the trends start to pop out. We can see some of that, definitely. I don't think, as I said before, the law of large numbers is necessarily in play where you can say this is what a bug is worth defensively and offensively just yet. But we're definitely working on that because it's a question that everyone wants the answer to.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should basically put an end to the if you find a bug, it's worth $10 billion on the black market. It's just not the case.
My missing cookie header is worth. It's going to make me a bug bounty millionaire. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We are out of time, unfortunately. So big thank you to Casey and Costin and Dave Eitel. And, back over to you, Matt.
Thank you, guys.